Well, it seems as though viewers enjoy videos about particular vehicles' flaws, and so we're going to try this as a little bit of a series here and discuss the flaws of this very popular luxury car, the 1972 Lincoln Mark IV. Now, the Lincoln Mark IV was a continuation of the Mark series that, let's just say, was reborn with the 1969 Lincoln Mark III. Of course, there were Mark series cars. There was the beautiful Mark II. And then there were the so-called forgotten marks, the Mark III, IV, and V of 1958, 59, and 1960 that somehow Ford Motor Company just forgot about when they decided to reintroduce the Mark III for 1969, probably because they wanted to forget about them, especially their abysmal sales. But the 1972 Mark IV really took Lincoln sales in a new direction. And the Mark IV, despite not having a convertible, actually topped the Eldorado sales of this generation. The Mark III sold around 25,000 units each year, but the Mark IV sales touched 40 and even 50,000 plus in some model years. It was a very popular car, despite being the most expensive in Lincoln's lineup. Now, the Mark IV was unquestionably a beautiful car from the exterior, and it's amazing because the car was almost stillborn in terms of this particular design because it was hated by Lee Iacocca. This design was approved by Bunky Knudsen when he was still president of the Ford Motor Company. He was Lee Iacocca's boss for a few brief years before he was ousted by Henry Ford II, the individual who brought him in. But Bunky Knudsen saw a clay model of this design in the Ford Design Center and effectively approved the clay model as it was, didn't want any changes to it. And when Lee Iacocca heard of this, he kept trying to have the designers make changes along with Don De La Rosa, and Bunky Knudsen would come in and say, no, I told you I want the clay model as it is. I don't want any changes. And the result is the beautiful Mark IV. And of course, you have some typical Ford elements here, or Lincoln elements, the so-called Rolls-Royce grille that got even more Rolls-Roycey with the Mark IV. This extremely long hood, long front overhangs. We'll see from the side view, the front and rear overhangs are almost symmetrical. But the car has a beautiful proportion to it and overall style, a slight taper to the front, slight taper to the rear that the Mark III just didn't have. And I think it gives the Mark IV that presence. The Mark V, by the way, really didn't have much of a taper front or rear either compared to the Mark IV. So when you look at the 3, 4, and the 5, the 4 really stands out. And here we have the side view. You notice that slight taper to the rear, of course, the Continental style spare tire trunk hump, which was characteristic of the Mark series. And what I love about the Mark IV is that the front fender is not totally flat. It does have a gentle lead in and rises as it goes toward the windshield, and that beautiful crease that is partway down the car. Here, unfortunately, there's a body side molding in the midsection of the car, but that crease is beautiful in how it kind of transitions into the wheel arches, which have beautiful surfacing with respect to the fender and the quarter and how they're integrated in the car. Just a gorgeous car overall, but unfortunately, as I said, there are quite a few flaws. So let's talk about those. And at number 10, we have the power door lock actuation. Now, power door lock actuation, you say, how hard can that be? Well, for a few years, particularly Ford and Chrysler employed an interesting way of activating the power door locks, which was that you either pushed up or down on the lock plunger. There wasn't a separate control that controlled the power door locks on the armrest. And this is seemingly okay if you're outside the car. Like, let's say you just unlock the car and then you're trying to unlock the other side for a passenger. You just pull up on the power door lock plunger and it activates both sides. And likewise, if you are trying to lock the car when you exit, you push down and it locks both doors. The problem comes if you want to lock the door while you're seated in the car. And that's a problem because in order to do so, you effectively have to do this kind of arm twisting motion in order to activate the lock plunger. And it's pretty uncomfortable and not all that easy. And I suspect that's why in short order, just another model year later, Ford was generally moving toward the power door lock on the armrest as opposed to using the lock plunger itself. I will also point out that, interestingly, the Mark II in 1972, the power door locks are electrically activated versus the Mark IIIs, which were vacuum, and other Ford cars, like the full-size vehicles, that were generally vacuum in 1972. So Ford was moving toward the electric lock setup by this point from its former vacuum setup. But that power door lock actuation is kind of bizarre on these, and that's why it makes it in at number 10. Now let's move to number 9. At number 9, we have the Rimlow steering wheel. The Rimlow steering wheel was a fad of many automakers during this time. GM, Ford, Chrysler, even AMC each had their own Rimlow steering wheel. And the idea here was that it was faster to honk the horn if you just didn't have to move your hand and you pinched the rim. You pinched the inner portion of the rim. There was this flexible, rubbery portion that you'd squeeze, and it would connect the circuit and honk the horn. Well, this particular car that you see here with this 3-spoke wheel, this is a Rimlow horn. Ford also had a 2-spoke wheel with cruise control. That was Rimlow as well. And it was a good idea, I think, in thought, but in practice, it was a bit awkward. And in particular, if you were parking, like parallel parking, people had a tendency to honk the horn because your fingers are kind of squeezing the rim a little bit. And I think it was more of an annoyance than anything. And so the Rimlow horn was a bit of a fad from, I would say, the late 60s to the early 70s. And Ford continued it on for a number of years into the mid-70s, and then after that, it was gone, and I think that was good. Of course, Ford on some cars, like the Fairmont, transitioned to the horn on a stalk on the steering column that people never quite got used to. That also proliferated through the Ford lineup on basically everything through the early 1980s, pretty much, before Ford sunset that horn honking idea. So Ford had a streak of bad ideas for how you wanted to honk your horn, but unfortunately, the Rimlow wheel in these is another flaw at number 9. Let's move on to number 8. And at number 8, we have the Mark IV's mushy ride. Now, hold on, people. People are going to say, that's what I like about these old cars. And my response to that is, yes, I do too. I love the soft, compliant suspensions that these cars have. But the Mark IV takes that to a whole new level. And if you haven't driven a Mark IV, wait before you lambast me. Go drive one because the car is so mushy, more mushy than the Mark III. I love the ride in the Mark III. I think it's composed. It's very soft. I love the ride in the Ford full-size cars of the era. I think, again, it's composed and soft. But the Mark IV just takes it to a whole new level. And I don't know if it's because the overhangs are so long between the front and the rear, or it's just that they wanted an even softer setup than the other cars. But the car always just has kind of this gentle, undulating waterbed motion as you drive it down the road. And it's not bad. It actually might even be called somewhat pleasant on a smooth road. But if you're going into any sort of twisty, turnies, moderate twist or turns, it kind of upsets the car. And it gets this weird motion. And they're all like that. All the Mark IVs that I've driven are like that. So I remember one time I was living in Raleigh, North Carolina, made a drive to Roanoke, Virginia, and it was a nice day out, and I decided to take my Mark IV because I thought, oh, what better day, and I'll take it for a nice long cruise. Well, what I didn't realize was that it was kind of a twisty, turny route to go between those two cities, up and down some hills. I won't call them mountains, but pretty steep hills. And I thought that I was going to have to pull over and get a barf bag about partway through because the car was just corkscrewing and moving around. And this is with new shocks. These are with the correct shocks. Like I said, I've driven many Mark IVs, and they're all like this. So just be prepared for an ultra mushy ride on a Mark IV. Again, I love the ride in the Mark III. I think it's excellent. The ride in the Mark IV isn't necessarily my favorite, but hey, it's maybe it's yours. It's certainly way softer than anything on the road today, by far. It's not even a close comparison. Let's move on to number 7. And at number 7, we have the automatic climate control in these cars. Now, automatic climate control, you say, what can be bad about that? Well, in general, it wasn't all that bad, but a couple things about this. This was really before a lot of auto companies would put in an ability to select the fan speed on your own or where the air was coming on your own. That would come a little bit later. I think customers were upset that the car was controlling all of that. It was a good thought that it was controlling where the air was coming out and the temperature, but some customers really just wanted to select that on their own. And that's one of the flaws with the system. You can't really select the fan speed. There's a low and the high. That doesn't mean that there's only 2 fan speeds. It just means that it basically had separate fan speeds, like a series of low fan speeds and a series of high fan speeds. I think there's 4 fan speeds, 4 or 5 on these Mark IVs that it switches between in either position. It just, when you have it selected on high, the fan's going to be a bit faster in all the settings, and on low, it's going to be a bit slower in all of the settings. But the main issue with the HVAC box in these is that they tended to make lots of clicking noises. Remember, there's no computer in here. This is all mechanically done. And I would say that if you are looking to buy a Mark IV, make sure that the HVAC works, because that is one thing that's tricky. There is Lincoln Land that I believe rebuilds the HVAC boxes. But, obviously it's getting hard to find automatic climate control components these days. And the systems are a bit finicky. And if you're buying a luxury car, you certainly want air conditioning, which, by the way, was GM powered, if we will. These have the GM A6 air conditioning compressor and Harrison setup under hood. So for all the Ford lovers, Ford did go to a GM setup in 1972 on the Lincolns, all the Lincolns, because it cooled better. So I don't want to hear it that GM is terrible from the Ford lovers. There's also GM power steering pump under hood, because Ford power steering pumps, while relatively reliable, always had a slight whine to them, especially in cold weather, and the GM pumps did not. So you got some GM componentry under hood, but I would just say the HVAC boxes on these are a little bit glitchy, in particular because now they're getting old. But even when they were new, they had problems with them. And so I would just recommend making sure that your HVAC works if you're going to buy one of these. Let's move on to number 6. And at number 6, we have the rear window operation, or lack thereof, in these cars. Now, clearly, the Mark IV has an opera window on many of the vehicles. This was an option before it became obligatory the next model year. So there are some Mark IVs that do not have opera windows for 1972, and those are my favorite. But interestingly, whether or not you got the opera window, the rear window does not retract fully. The rear window on these retracts into the sail panel, not downward, which was true for the Mark III as well. But on the Mark III, the rear window retracted all the way. Of course, there was no opera window option on the Mark III. But on the Mark IV, it doesn't matter. If you get the opera window or not, that rear window doesn't retract all the way. When you have the opera window, it retracts maybe 2 inches. When you don't have the opera window, it retracts maybe 3 to 4, and it still has a glass pane that's sticking out. In fact, in the picture that you see here, the rear window is, believe it or not, in its fully retracted position. And so it's pretty much useless. You get maybe, like I said, a couple inches of ventilation if you're trying to open the rear window. And I don't know why Ford did that as opposed to having it going like down into the vehicle, but they did. And in fact, shortly thereafter, in the 1972 model year, Ford would eliminate the power window from the rears on not just the Mark IV, but also other cars that had good-sized rear windows, like the full-size Fords. They would make them stationary, presumably to take cost as well as weight out. But for 1972, you had the ability to move that rear window. It just really didn't go anywhere, and it's pretty useless. And maybe from the beginning, they should have saved the money and the weight, but they didn't. Let's move on to number 5. And at number 5, we're going to have something under hood, and that is the AutoLite 4300 carburetor. Now, the Mark IVs came standard with Ford's 460 V8, the low compression V8, and I could actually say the carburetor may be an engine head combination for 1972, the D2VE heads. Neither of these were great. So let's start with the carburetor, and I'll say the AutoLite 4300 carburetor came out in 1967, and it had a troubled run throughout its entire, let's say, usage by Ford Motor Company, which extended into the latter part of the 1970s. So what are the problems on these? Well, they have an interesting setup. They have 2 needles and seats. They have a primary needle and seat and a secondary needle and seat, and the float activates both of those. The float is actually on the underside of the air horn, and the problem is that the secondary needle and seat is really just held closed by gravity. And as a consequence, they had a tendency to stick open, and then the cars would flood out. In fact, if you get a rebuilt AutoLite 4300 carburetor, then almost all rebuilders blocked off the secondary needle and seat. And the truth is you really didn't need the secondary needle and seat unless you're doing quarter-mile drag races. I've blocked all of them off in my cars, and I have no drivability issues. You can floor it and keep it floored for quite some time. The primary needle and seat can keep up by and large. Probably after, let's say 7 or 8 seconds, it might lean out or somewhere thereabouts. But, overall, it's not really an issue. But these carburetors would flood out. They wouldn't necessarily start right. The choke operation wasn't great. You couldn't adjust the choke pull-off like you could on the Rochester carburetors. And beyond that, they also were kind of leanly jetted. So many cars with them, when you first step on the accelerator, have kind of a lean feeling. There's not all that much response until the power valve kicks in, beyond, let's say, a quarter to a third of the pedal travel. So that kind of gives the cars a bit of a boggy feeling too. And, poor reliability, let's say, in terms of starting and flooding out, and also not as great drivability, have lent these carburetors to, let's just say, have a bad reputation. And I think it's deserved. I run a lot of them on my cars, but I don't trust them as much as I trust others. And on some cars that I have, I've actually replaced them with aftermarket Edelbrock's or Holley carburetors. And I got to tell you, the cars run way better with the Edelbrock's or the Holley carburetors on them. I've kept the original carbs, and I have it on many of the cars. Like I said, these AutoLite 4300s just aren't great. Amazing, because the AutoLite 2100 two-barrel carbs used in this era were fantastic and very, very reliable. And the AutoLite 4100 that the 2100 was based on were good carburetors, but not the 4300. Let's move on to number 4. And at number 4, we have the complete lack of trunk space in these vehicles. Now, lack of trunk space, you say, how can that be? This car is massive. It's a massive vehicle, but trust me, these cars do not have a big trunk at all. Part of that is that taper that I was talking about in the beginning from a styling perspective. So the trunk isn't very deep. And most Fords, the full-size Fords of this era, had the fuel tank positioned vertically near the rear axle. The Mark IV had the fuel tank underneath the trunk floor. And so they don't have the deep well like the Mark III did and the full-size cars from Ford did. And they have a full-size spare tire that's got nowhere to go. So it takes up like half the trunk. And it's not a deep trunk. So you don't have much trunk room. I would estimate maybe with the spare tire in, you have 12 cubic feet, 12 to 13 cubic feet. It's really not much. It's kind of like a modern day compactish car, I would say, is probably similar trunk volume as the Mark IV. So despite the vehicle's humorously large size, the trunk is humorously small. So, if you're driving one of these vehicles around now as just a pleasure cruiser, it probably doesn't matter. But if you wanted to fit a couple of golf bags in here back in the day, you're going to struggle. Or if you wanted to fit quite a few big suitcases, you're going to struggle too. And like I said, it's amazingly small for the size of the vehicle. Now we're getting into the home stretch. So let's go with number 3. And at number 3, we have the flammable power seat switches. Now, this wasn't so much a problem when the cars were new, in fairness to Ford. But now that they're 50 years old, 50 years plus, to be honest, this issue is kind of creeping up for cars that were stored in moist environments in particular. And that is that some of the contacts in the power seat switches corrode. And then because the current is always flowing to the power seat switch, whether the car is on or off, then sometimes the seat switches catch fire and then the whole car catches fire. It's becoming increasingly common. So a couple things I would recommend for owners of these cars. One is check the contacts and make sure they're not green and, kind of tinted, let's call it, and corroded. Because if they are, you need to either get a new switch or clean the contacts out of that because you're at risk for a fire. Now, the other thing that I do in my Mark IV is whenever I have it parked for extended periods of time, I just unhook the battery, and that way there's no current flowing to the switch. You could rewire the switch so that it wasn't hot all the time and was just hot with the key on. That's relatively complicated, but I've checked the contacts in mine, and they're perfect. And like I said, so when I store it for long periods of time, I unhook the battery, and that way you just don't have to worry. It's peace of mind, and these cars don't have any battery drain anyway, but like I said, there's nothing worse than having your beautiful vehicle, let's say, consumed by fire. So just be aware of that. That's why that's in the top 3 list here. Let's move on to number 2. And at number 2, we have the overall squinty greenhouse in the Mark IV. I already commented on the rear window and its operation being relatively worthless. But I have to say that the Mark IV of any car that I've been in of the era has almost the hardest cockpit to see out of. And remember, a passenger side rear view mirror was not standard on these cars, so it's relatively tough. I don't really mind the lack of a passenger side outside rear view mirror on most vehicles of the era. It's fine because you have good sight lines out of the car, and it's not really a problem. But on these Mark IVs, the C-pillar is very chunky, and the upper window really doesn't help all that much in terms of seeing a car that's in your blind spot on the right-hand side. But the overall feeling in a Mark IV is pretty claustrophobic. The Mark III had a low roof and a high belt line, but the Mark IV took that to an even new dimension, and you can see that the roof kind of wraps over the side of the car, and the belt line is also quite high. And adding to this claustrophobic kind of effect is the fact that the dashboard is extremely tall. So the distance from the top of the dash to the windshield is less than a foot. It's like 10 inches. So you don't have all that much space to see out of in terms of the front view. And then the rear and the side view are also pretty minimal. So I would say before you buy one of these, they certainly look cool, but that's something that takes a little getting used to. It's almost like a sports car in terms of how much glass area you have inside. The Mark V would give more glass area, I think in part because the customers of the Mark IV, that was one of the principal complaints. But at least the Mark IV looked cool, and that's just the price that you have to pay. Now let's move on to number one. At number one, we have the overall material quality in the Mark IV. Now, the material quality, I would say, on the Mark IV was above what you would get from the GM side of the, let's say, Big Three and the Eldorado in particular, which, despite looking pretty good, I like the way the 72 Eldorado looks. The interior materials and fit and finish are abysmal, just terrible on the 72 Eldorado. 72 Imperial wasn't that bad. I actually think the 72 Imperial might be the best of the three, between the Imperial and the Lincolns and the GM cars. But if you were an owner of a Mark III and you traded it in on a Mark IV, you would have been disappointed by the interior materials in the Mark IV. The latter 2 years of the Mark III had real wood trim. The Mark IV, it didn't matter any year, had fake wood trim. At least if you got a 69 Mark III that still had the fake wood trim, it was convincingly fake. The Mark IV is not so convincing, in part because on the dash they use two different types of fake wood grain. I think it's pecan wood as well as burl walnut, and neither is convincing in how it looks. It just looks so fake. But beyond the fake wood, which was, let's say, in many vehicles of the era, just the overall feeling of the interior is not the same as the Mark III, whether that's the door closures or the switch feel or, just the looks and the materials. You don't have the padded A-pillars anymore like you did on the Mark III, beautifully padded A-pillars on the Mark III, and that's gone. A lot of the kind of really high-end finishings in the Mark III were gone in the Mark IV. And again, like I said, it's not bad in the Mark IV. It's just not what it was in the Mark III. Even the door panels have quite a bit of hard plastic. Yes, you have a full-length armrest that the upper portion is padded. But beneath that, the lower portion is hard plastic and kind of cheap looking. At least you got thick, very thick pile carpeting in the Mark IV and really good sound deadening. These cars are very, very, very quiet, extremely quiet. Not only for the time, but even by modern standards. But I wish that the material quality had been better. I will say the exterior fit and finish on these cars is pretty gosh darn good. In fact, Lincoln was using sheet metal from the Budd Company as opposed to making it in-house. The Budd Company was supplying the Wixom plant because Lincoln felt that they could get better stamping quality from the Budd Company than their own internal presses. So that tells you a lot about what you need to know. But nonetheless, the overall material quality of the interior, I would say in particular, is not great. So what do you think about the Mark IV and its flaws? Put a comment in the comment section. Any others that I forgot? Did I get them wrong? Or do you agree and do you like this series? Let me know. Thanks again for watching.